quarterback thing, yeah, I mean, I've said all along, I think Shedeur's presence will be a hindrance to some guy. Not somebody's going to take the job. They pay really well, and there's only 32 of the job. Somebody will take it. But there are candidates out there who will look at this and say, nope, I want nothing to do with that. How could you? Look at everything that Kevin went through over the last year with Shedeur and some of the stupidity and nonsense that was out there. What coach would want to sign up for that? Particularly when he didn't play that well. He wasn't that good. Like, I've been pretty adamant. He shouldn't be on this team. Like, to me, Shedeur should not be on this team next year. He's not good enough to be the starter, and this organization is not stable and mature enough to have him as a backup. They've proven that. So what, are you going to draft another quarterback and put him atop Shedeur, and then all the stuff comes back again about, well, what about Shedeur? When are you going to play Shedeur? Like, no thanks, hard pass.
Cleveland insider Ken Carman just called out Jason Lloyd on air, and what he said about Shedeur Sanders is raising a lot of uncomfortable questions. We're talking about one of the most respected voices in Cleveland sports publicly challenging another media figure for what he's calling a pattern of unfair criticism aimed at the Browns quarterback. This isn't just hot takes or debate. This is one insider saying another crossed a line. And when you listen to what was actually said, you start to see why people are talking. Jason Lloyd went on the Ken Carman and Anthony Lima show, and the conversation about Shedeur Sanders got intense real fast. Lloyd didn't just question Sanders' play, he said Sanders shouldn't be on the team next year. Not that he shouldn't start, not that he needs development. He said Sanders shouldn't even be on the roster. That's a nuclear take for a quarterback who's still early in his career, playing behind one of the most unstable situations in the league. And Carman pushed back hard, live on air, calling out what he saw as media-driven nonsense that had nothing to do with what was actually happening in the building. Let me walk you through what was said, because the exact words matter here. Lloyd's position was clear. Shedeur Sanders is a hindrance. He used that word specifically, hindrance. He talked about how any coaching candidate looking at the Browns' job would see Sanders and say, nope, I want nothing to do with that. He brought up everything the organization went through with Sanders this past season and called it stupidity and nonsense. Then he said Sanders wasn't good enough to be the starter and that the Browns aren't stable or mature enough to have him as a backup. His conclusion: Sanders should not be on this team next year. Now pause right there. That's not just criticism of performance. That's saying a young quarterback is such a problem that he needs to be completely removed from the organization. And when Carman pushed back asking what the Browns actually went through, Lloyd referenced locker room stuff and drama. But here's where it gets interesting. Carman immediately challenged that. He said he thought most of that was media stuff, not actual problems in the building. He didn't think Sanders was a distraction to the people who actually worked with him every day. That's a massive difference. One guy is saying the locker room was a mess because of Sanders. The other guy is saying the media created that narrative and it wasn't real. So which is it? From what we've seen publicly, there were definitely storylines around Sanders this season. The Dillon Gabriel situation got attention. There were questions about the depth chart. There were debates about when Sanders should play and how much. But were those actual team issues, or were those media narratives that got amplified because they generated clicks and conversation? That's the question Carman is raising, and it's uncomfortable because it challenges the entire basis of Lloyd's criticism. Let's break down the timeline of how Shedeur Sanders ended up in Cleveland and what actually happened once he got there, because context matters even if it's not an excuse. Sanders came into the league with massive hype. Colorado visibility, primetime sun, big arm, competitive fire. Everyone knew who he was before he ever took a snap. The Browns drafted him and immediately the expectations were sky high. But the situation he walked into wasn't exactly set up for success. Kevin Stefanski was already on the hot seat. The quarterback room was a mess. Deshaun Watson was still there, still getting paid, still the albatross hanging over everything. The offensive line had issues, the receiving core was inconsistent, and the entire organization was in transition mode. Sanders didn't get handed the keys day one. That's important. He wasn't immediately the starter. There were reps with other quarterbacks. There were decisions made about the depth chart that kept him lower than people expected. Dillon Gabriel was in the building, and that created its own set of questions. Why was Gabriel there if Sanders was supposed to be the future? What did that say about how the coaching staff viewed Sanders? And when Sanders did get opportunities, they came in situations that weren't exactly favorable. So you've got a young quarterback trying to prove himself in an unstable environment, with media scrutiny at a level most rookies never experience, and coaching decisions that raised eyebrows. That's the backdrop. And through all of that, based on the footage we've seen, Sanders handled himself with composure. He didn't publicly complain. He didn't throw anyone under the bus. He showed up, competed, and tried to make plays when his number was called. But according to Jason Lloyd, all of that amounts to Sanders being a problem the Browns need to remove. And that's where Ken Carman draws the line. Carman's defense wasn't just about Sanders as a player, it was about the fairness of how he's being covered. He specifically called out the idea that locker room issues were fabricated, that the drama was external, not internal. He pushed back on the idea that Sanders was some massive distraction that derailed the season, and when Lloyd doubled down, Carman kept pressing. You could hear the frustration in his voice, not just disagreement, but genuine concern about the narrative being built around a young black quarterback in Cleveland. And that's where this conversation gets really uncomfortable because Carman explicitly brought up race. He pointed out that historically, black quarterbacks face different standards, their mistakes get magnified, their leadership gets questioned differently. The criticism focuses on intangibles and character rather than just stats and mechanics. And when you look at how Sanders has been covered versus how other young quarterbacks in similar situations have been covered, the pattern is hard to ignore. Lloyd's response included calling Sanders potentially the worst quarterback of this century. Think about that for a second. The worst quarterback of this century. That's a comparison to Marcus Russell, Ryan Leaf, guys who flamed out spectacularly and never recovered. Sanders is still early in his career, playing in a dysfunctional situation, and he's already being grouped with the biggest busts in NFL history. Is that analysis, or is that something else? Carman clearly thinks it's something else, and a lot of fans agree with him. This isn't excuses, this is context. Two things can be true at once. Sanders can have areas where he needs to improve, and the criticism can still be disproportionate and unfair. He can have made mistakes, and the narrative around him can still be influenced by bias. Young quarterbacks struggle all the time. They play in bad situations all the time. They take time to develop all the time. But they don't all get called the worst of the century and told they shouldn't even be on the roster anymore. What makes Sanders different? From what we've seen in the footage, Sanders showed toughness. He took hits and got back up. He made throws under pressure. He didn't have elite weapons or consistent protection, but he competed. Were there bad plays? Absolutely. Were there games where the stats didn't look great? For sure. But show me a rookie quarterback in a dysfunctional offense who puts up Pro Bowl numbers. It doesn't happen. Development takes time, especially when the infrastructure around you is shaky. But Lloyd's criticism doesn't focus on development. It focuses on removal. It focuses on Sanders being a hindrance to future coaching candidates. And that raises questions. What exactly did Sanders do that was so problematic? What locker room issues can actually be traced back to him versus the media amplifying storylines? What coaching candidates are actually saying they won't come to Cleveland because of Sanders? Those are legitimate questions. And the fact that Lloyd's answers seem to rely on vague references to stupidity and nonsense without concrete examples makes Carman's pushback even more pointed. The organizational context can't be ignored either. Kevin Stefanski got fired while Andrew Barry stayed. That tells you something about where the blame was being assigned internally. If Sanders was truly the massive problem Lloyd describes, wouldn't the front office be looking to move on from him too? Instead, Barry remains, and the coaching change suggests the issue was more about scheme, game management, and staff decisions than about the young quarterback. But some media figures seem determined to redirect the frustration onto Sanders anyway. It's easier to make a player the scapegoat than to dissect complex organizational failures. It's cleaner narratively to point at the young guy with the famous last name and say that's the problem than to break down coaching philosophy, roster construction, and front office decision-making. Carman is calling that out, and it's uncomfortable because it forces people to examine their own assumptions. The emotional weight of this for Sanders has to be massive. Imagine being a young player trying to establish yourself at the highest level of your profession, and every mistake you make gets turned into proof that you're a cancer, a distraction, a bust. Every decision your coaches make gets blamed on you. Every narrative gets twisted to make you the villain. That's not just pressure, that's designed to break you. And through it all, Sanders has maintained composure publicly. He hasn't lashed out, he hasn't demanded trades, he hasn't thrown teammates under the bus. Based on what we've seen and heard from people actually in the building, he's been a professional, but that doesn't fit the narrative some media members want to tell. The Dillon Gabriel situation is a perfect example. Gabriel's presence in Cleveland raised obvious questions. Why bring in another young quarterback if you believe in Sanders? What message does that send? But instead of focusing on the coaching staff's mixed messaging or the front office's unclear vision, some of the criticism got redirected at Sanders for being in a quarterback room with competition. As if that's unusual. As if every NFL team doesn't have multiple quarterbacks. As if the mere presence of Sanders somehow created dysfunction. That's not analysis, that's narrative building, and it's the kind of thing Carman is pushing back against. Lloyd also made the point that the Browns aren't stable or mature enough to have Sanders as a backup. Unpack that for a second. He's saying the organization can't handle Sanders not starting because of all the noise that would come with it. But where does that noise come from? It comes from media members asking, when are you going to play Sanders? And what about Sanders, and creating storylines about quarterback controversies. The media creates the instability, then blames the player for the instability existing. It's a self-fulfilling cycle, and Carman is one of the few people willing to call it out in real time. The comparison to historical treatment of black quarterbacks adds another layer. This isn't new. We've seen it with other players. The scrutiny is different, the language is different, the patience is different. White quarterbacks get called projects who need time to develop. Black quarterbacks get called athletic but raw with questions about their football IQ. White quarterbacks get multiple seasons to prove themselves. Black quarterbacks get labeled busts after one rough year. Sanders is experiencing that pattern in real time. And when someone like Carman points it out, it forces an uncomfortable conversation that a lot of people would rather avoid. Fan reaction to this has been intense. Social media exploded with people defending Sanders, highlighting his clutch moments, his leadership, his statistical accomplishments relative to the situation he was in. People started pulling up clips of throws he made under pressure, drives he led in critical moments, examples of him making something out of nothing. The narrative Lloyd was pushing didn't match what fans were actually seeing when they watched the games. That disconnect matters. When the criticism doesn't align with observable reality, people start asking why. And the answers to that why get uncomfortable fast. This also isn't happening in a vacuum. The Browns have been under a microscope for years. The Watson trade and contract, the constant coaching turnover, the dysfunction at the organizational level. Sanders walked into all of that as a young player with zero ability to control any of it, but somehow he's being held responsible for the chaos. Lloyd's take that coaching candidates will see Sanders and run the other way implies Sanders is the problem rather than the instability, the ownership decisions, the front office confusion, the media circus. But which is more likely to scare off a coaching candidate? A young quarterback with potential who needs development, or an organization that's been dysfunctional for decades? Put it this way, if you're a head coaching candidate, are you more worried about working with Shedeur Sanders, or are you more worried about working for an organization that gave Deshaun Watson a fully guaranteed contract, cycled through multiple coaching staffs, and has media members publicly trashing their own players? The answer seems obvious, but it doesn't fit the narrative Lloyd wants to tell. Carman's frustration on air was palpable. You could hear it in his voice. This wasn't just a disagreement about football analysis. This was about fairness, about responsibility, about the impact these narratives have on a young person's career and reputation. When you have a platform as big as Lloyd's, your words carry weight. And when those words are used to paint a player as a problem, a distraction, someone who should be removed from the team entirely, that has consequences. Sanders is still building his career. His reputation is still being formed, and media narratives shape how front offices, coaches, fans, and future teams view him. If the narrative is he's a cancer who destroys locker rooms, that follows him. Even if it's not true, even if it's fabricated, once the narrative takes hold, it's almost impossible to shake. That's what makes Carman's pushback so important. He's not just defending Sanders' play. He's defending Sanders' right to be evaluated fairly without racial bias, without media-driven storylines, without being scapegoated for organizational failures beyond his control. The contrast between what Lloyd said and what Carman observed is stark. Lloyd talked about locker room problems and dysfunction. Carman said he didn't think Sanders was a problem in the building. Lloyd said coaching candidates would avoid Cleveland because of Sanders. Carman said the issues were media-created, not real. Lloyd said Sanders wasn't good enough. Carman said Sanders deserved to be evaluated in context. One of those perspectives is based on observable facts and insider knowledge. The other seems based on narrative and assumption, and the difference matters. There's also the question of timing. This criticism of Sanders is coming after a season where the entire organization was in flux. Coaching staff changes, front office uncertainty, roster issues across the board. The team didn't win because of systemic problems, not because one young quarterback somehow sabotaged everything. But the criticism is being aimed almost exclusively at Sanders. Why? If you're looking at the Browns' failures this season, Sanders isn't even in the top 5 problems. The offensive line had issues, the defense had issues, the coaching had issues. The quarterback room had issues that existed before Sanders and would have existed without him, but he's the one being told he shouldn't even be on the team anymore. That doesn't add up unless there's something else influencing the criticism. Carman's point about media members creating controversy rather than reporting reality hits hard, because we've all seen it. We've all watched narratives get spun, storylines get manufactured, drama get amplified for clicks and engagement. And young players, especially young black players, bear the brunt of it. Sanders didn't ask for any of this. He didn't ask to be Prime's son. He didn't ask to come into a dysfunctional organization. He didn't ask to be under a microscope from day one. He just wanted to play football. And instead, he's dealing with media members calling him the worst quarterback of the century and saying he needs to be cut. That's not fair, and Carman is right to call it out. The broader conversation this has sparked goes beyond just Sanders or the Browns. It's about how we evaluate young quarterbacks. It's about media responsibility. It's about racial bias in sports coverage. It's about the difference between analysis and agenda. Lloyd might genuinely believe everything he said. He might think Sanders is a problem and the Browns would be better without him. But belief doesn't make it true. And when your belief aligns perfectly with historical patterns of bias, it's worth examining where that belief comes from. Carman is doing that examination publicly, and it's making people uncomfortable, which is probably the point. The open question now is what happens next. Does this change how Sanders gets covered going forward? Do other media members start examining their own biases? Does the organization make decisions based on actual performance and potential, or do they cave to the manufactured narrative? We don't know yet. The story is still unfolding, but what we do know is that Ken Carman drew a line. He said publicly that what Jason Lloyd was doing wasn't fair, wasn't accurate, and wasn't acceptable. He defended Sanders not just as a player, but as a person deserving of fair treatment. And a lot of people are listening. This isn't about making excuses for bad play. This isn't about pretending Sanders is perfect or that he doesn't have areas to improve. This is about asking whether the criticism is proportional, whether it's fair, whether it's based on actual evidence or manufactured narrative. Based on what Carman said and based on what we've observed, the answer to those questions is uncomfortable. The criticism doesn't match the reality, the narrative doesn't match what people in the building actually experienced, and the pattern looks a lot like bias. Sanders is still young, his career is still being written, but the way he's being covered right now is trying to write the ending before the story has really begun, and that's what Ken Carman is fighting against. Whether it makes a difference remains to be seen, but at least someone is asking the questions that need to be asked. At least someone is pushing back on narratives that don't hold up under scrutiny. At least someone is demanding fairness for a young player trying to make it in an environment designed to break him. That matters, even if we don't know yet how this ends, even if the questions don't have easy answers, even if the conversation makes people uncomfortable. Maybe that discomfort is exactly what's needed right now. Because until we're willing to examine our biases, challenge our narratives, and demand better from the people with platforms, players like Shedeur Sanders will keep getting unfairly targeted, and voices like Ken Carman's will keep being necessary to call it out. The conversation is happening, the exposure is real, and the questions aren't going away. What was really going on in that locker room? What are coaching candidates actually saying? What is Sanders being judged on his play or something else entirely? Ken Carman says he knows the answer. Jason Lloyd says he knows too. They can't both be right. And somewhere in that gap between their perspectives is a young quarterback just trying to prove he belongs while the media decides his story for him.